Today is the last episode in our Summer Story series, and we have a big one for you. Emily Henry could not be hotter right now. Her latest book, Funny Story, is once again a New York Times bestseller, and she is adapting it for a series. Happy Place, Beach Read, and People We Meet on Vacation are also in various stages of film and series adaptation. Emily is smart, funny, and kind, and she's continually working to guide up-and-coming writers. We hope you enjoy getting to know Emily a little better. We are so excited. We're getting you at such a time. Well, these announcements this week, congratulations.
Thank you.
It has been a busy couple of weeks in your world.
It has been, but I mean, you know how things work. It's like a lot of this has been in the works for a very long time, so it's mostly just sort of like the celebration week.
That's good. It's fun to celebrate. What so where I don't even know where to start. You have so many things we want to talk about, with the books obviously being, New York Times bestsellers and how exciting that is. And I would love to hear the kind of your take on that, on what we hear publicly with, oh my god, Jennifer Lopez is involved and it's going to be this and a series and a movie and kind of that world of it. But maybe, I don't know, Renee, maybe we get to that in a minute. Get to I'll start at the start, I guess. Don't want to get ahead of myself on those.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So where is the start? What are you
Where
wanting
is
to
the
know?
start?
Yes.
Why don't we kind
So
of start?
we love to hear from you of kind of your journey, your path. Did you know that you always wanted to write? Did you come from a creative family? How did you get to be a New York Times? What was that path?
Yeah, I feel like I was, this is not going to be that interesting. I feel like this is the most common answer, but I was just a huge reader, and I came from a family of readers. I definitely would say it came from a family of creative people too. My dad is a musician, and he has done some songwriting, and my mom loves to paint. Like, they're very artistic people, but the big thing was they were huge readers, and that was a big piece of my childhood, and our family time together was reading together. So that was always just around me, and I remember when you're like 8 years old, that's when teachers start asking you what you want to be when you grow up, which kind of makes me feel sick now thinking about it. But at the time, that was kind of what made me realize, oh, people are writing these books that I'm reading and loving. Like, it hadn't really occurred to me that there were people on the other end of them and that was their job. Reading was just like going to the playground. Like, it was just the best thing. It was just a fun thing. And so realizing that was a job, I immediately was like, okay, well, that's probably what I'll be when I grow up, because reading is just my favorite thing. And I had started dabbling in writing as soon as I was old enough to write, just because I would get caught up on whatever series I was reading and want there to be more, and write essentially what I now know as fan fiction. So it really just stemmed from a love of reading. And I also was very lucky that my parents were both like just so encouraging and supportive, to the extent that it probably gave me like some delusions about how easy some of it would be, because they were just, anything that my brothers or I said we wanted to do, they were just like, okay, great. You can do that. Like, you'll have to work hard, but I'm sure you can do that. And even recently, my father's sister was in town, and we were all hanging out. She was asking like kind of these same questions, like, when did you know you wanted to be a writer and all of that? And did you feel, pressure that like you wouldn't be able to, or you needed to be more realistic? And I was just like, no, my parents never gave me that realism gene. They always told me I could do, like, it's kind of the joke about millennials, but they really did tell me I could do whatever I put my mind to. And my dad looked at his sister and was like, who does that sound like? And they were talking about my grandfather, who was like, just the same way with his 3 kids, just like, of course you can do whatever you want to do. And yeah, so I think just having that support system made a huge difference for me, feeling like this is maybe a rather unrealistic thing to pursue, but I'm going to pursue it.
Did you ever think about I'm not at 8 years old, I hope you're not going to say yes, but after, did you ever think about like the business side of thing, like editing or
Oh.
publishing or that side of the world, of the literary
Like
world?
working in it, or just like that it would exist, that it would be a part of my life?
No, working in it.
Oh,
That's like
yeah.
because your love of reading. Did you
Yeah.
think about, whoa, somebody's editing these books, somebody's
Yeah.
publishing these books?
I think in college, it occurred to me that that might be, more of a realistic, like in college, actually, I was like, oh, I'm going to go to school forever and become an English professor. And then I can, publish eventually and gradually, but mostly be teaching. And that seemed like a more viable path to me. And then I remember meeting with an advisor who was basically like, it is impossible to get jobs teaching college at this point. Like, it's such a competitive industry and not actually for great money. And it was sort of funny
Yeah.
because he was just sort of like, publishing is maybe more realistic than teaching, at least at that, at the university level. So
Mhm.
I considered it, but it was always like, writing was always the piece of it, the coming up with things, the imagining, the creative part of it was what was exciting to me. And it still kind of blows my mind and thrills me when I talk to any member of my publishing team that there are people who actually want those other jobs, because I so thoroughly do not want those other jobs. And it's like such a joy. And I don't know, it just really makes me so happy that there are people out there who love being book agents and who love being editors, who love being book publicists. It's like, we need all of those people, and I can't imagine really doing any of those jobs.
So you're of the creative side through and through.
Through and through. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I think I've thought a lot about what drives someone to pursue a like career in the arts, because basically, like what you were just talking about, it's like there is a business side of things, and that side is very different from the art side of things, and it's, not fun usually. But I've thought a lot about it because I think everybody has a natural creativity to them, and it's always made me wonder, like, how is it possible that not everyone wants my job, or like not everyone wants to be a painter or a songwriter or whatever. And I think that so much of what we want is decided by that, by kind of like almost an addiction to a certain feeling, where I felt that flow state feeling that some people get, probably doing complicated math problems, whatever. I felt that first and most often for writing. And I feel like my whole life is sort of chasing that feeling, because most of the time writing does not feel like that. Most of the time it's just a job like any other. You're working, you're cranking things out of yourself. But when you hit that moment where it becomes more of a free fall feeling, or like you finally have momentum and you don't feel like you are coming up with things so much as things are passing through you, that is the best feeling I've ever found in life so far. So I think that is why probably I'm a writer, is that's what I felt that when I was 8 years old, writing my own stories, and it felt like magic. It felt like, I don't know, like some kind of transcendent like meditation or something. It felt it felt like more real than the real world.
So when you weren't in that state, or when you were just starting out and you didn't, what helped you push through to continue that, and to continue writing? Beside, I mean, obviously you've got such family support, which
Yeah.
is so huge and foremost, but what else helped you kind of go through those hurdles when you were a young writer starting out?
I think desperation. I mean, really, I have had a lot of other jobs that I was very ill suited for, and that were ill suited for me. And when I got my agent, I had a full time job doing technical writing, which I just loathed. And I was so desperate to get out of there. And I think part of it really was just feeling like there was no other job for me. I mean, I could work at a bookstore. I mean, there are jobs I could do. There are jobs I could do and probably be
Yeah.
okay. But I don't think that there was a single other job that I would be truly happy doing or fulfilled. And I know that's like such a privilege to be able to make that kind of decision based on just like what will make you happy and not only what you need. So I think a lot of it really was just desperation that drove me to keep writing, even when it was hard. I had to get up before work to write, because when you have a full-time job, there's just not energy usually after work. And so
Mhm.
I'm not a morning person, but I would get up at like 5 in the morning and write before I'd go to the office, and spend my Saturdays and my Sundays writing usually. And it really felt like a life raft I was building for myself.
So a lot of our audience are obviously creative, similar to yourself.
Yeah.
And part of the process, and one of the things we love to explore, is just, how you took the leap. How did you find your agent? How did you build your team? What were the biggest surprises for you, when you were writing,
Yeah.
and how you transformed into your career? Because I think a lot of our audience and a lot of our, a lot of our community is focused on, how do I take that leap, right? Or what do
Right.
I need to through, and what were the biggest surprises for you? Obviously everybody's journey is different, but in terms of your path, what did that look like for you?
Yeah. So I did not have like a writing community around me in person or anything. So I really was relying very heavily on the internet, which is nice because when people do ask for advice, like, how do I find an agent? It's like, well, you do a lot of Googling, and I know you probably at least, hopefully you're at least close to a library where you can go do that. But um, so it really was just so much Googling and reading about like, how do I find an agent, and like examples of good query letters, and keeping an Excel sheet of like who I was querying, and when I wasn't getting requests for the manuscript, rewriting the query letter, which is for some reason so much harder than writing a book. But something that did surprise me about all of that was, I obviously thought, okay, um, I need to find like a powerhouse agent. Like that's what you should do, is you should find your favorite and most successful authors who are doing something similar-ish to what you're doing, and then find their agents and query those agents. And I remember I had a mentor figure who worked in publishing, and I remember telling him that I had started querying, and maybe even like I maybe was like kind of down in the dumps because I'd gotten a rejection, just like a flat rejection, no request, whatever, from an agent I'd been really excited about. And he was like, well, first of all, I know that agent, and personality wise I don't think you would be a match, so there's that. And second of all, like, that is an agent who has this other very, very, very famous, successful author, which means most of their time is going to that person. That they're keeping that person's very big, large career going, and they're managing probably a lot more. And this mentor of mine was like, you don't want some successful author's agent. You want the agent who's going to be that for you someday. You want someone who's as young and hungry as you are. And that was really interesting, helpful information to have. And then, in the years since I got my agent, who was she was newish to the business, and she was young and hungry, I could see that she had other deals with publishers and all of that. Like, it wasn't like I was her first client or anything, but she hadn't had like some career making moment as far as agenting. And she was just very fast, very on top of everything, and personality wise, it was a match. And it was like that advice that helped me to find her and to feel comfortable like signing with her. And I remember in the years after that, like making friends with other debut authors, newish authors who had signed with kind of big name agents, who already had like their one or two huge clients that they were doing, a million things for. And I did have conversations with friends who were really discouraged and who felt like their agents didn't have any time for them. And like, if the first book they took out on submission didn't sell, then it was sort of like, oh, this agent was so excited about me, and now she's just totally over me and doesn't reply to my emails and all of that. And it's sad that that's the case. And I definitely also know big agents who are the exception, who are great for all of their clients and whatnot. But it was really such a general truth that I witnessed among my friends, that like the agents who already had sort of superstar authors on their roster were not as present as they could be or should be for their newer clients. So yeah, that was a surprise. And then as far as building my team, it was like I had that agent for a few years and she was great and I loved her. And then she ended up retiring from agenting to focus on her own writing. And at that point, she put me in touch with her agent. And her agent actually worked a lot more in the space that I was trying to move into, which was the romantic comedy space. And she was like, and actually, I passed along this book that you were writing, Betrayed, and she loves it. She wants to talk to you. So no pressure. If you want to stay with this agency, you can, but just, there are other agents out there. And so I ended up doing a few calls with different agents at that point and ended up signing with my former agent's writing agent. And she's just wonderful, and has been a dream. And yeah, I mean, it's weird because with publishing, I'm not sure how different it is from other fields in that like you're really only building your team. When you are building your team, it's like two people. You're choosing an agent and hoping that they choose you back, and the same thing happens later with an editor. And then your marketer, your publicist, everyone else is just sort of part of the publishing house, and you don't have a say in it. And you might get really, really, really lucky like I did, or you might have a lot of turnover in your team. I definitely have friends who have not even managed to have the same editor from book to book because it's such a fluctuating industry where people are often leaving their publisher because it's like the only way you can get a promotion or a raise is to go somewhere else. So I've just been very, very lucky, honestly, which is not great like advice for people listening.
Yeah.
Like be lucky, but choosing an agent is within your control, and it's better. Everybody says it's better to have no agent than a bad agent, and that is absolutely true. You do not want to sign with someone who is just keeping you on the hook, but you can't get their attention and they're not answering your emails and they disappear for months at a time, or like they're trying to charge you money for something before they've made any money. Like, that you don't want that. You want someone who is really going to be a champion for you, and you shouldn't just feel like, oh, I'm so lucky that this person would even consider me. Like you should get the feeling that they also feel lucky. It's like dating, basically. You don't settle for someone just because like they look good on paper.
What have you learned through the editing process?
Oh my gosh.
Because I think we've spoken to a lot of different authors over the past few weeks and months, and editing seems to be a point of finding the right editor, one that really understands your voice. So I'd love to hear your experience of your editing kind of path.
Yeah. That is I mean, again, it's so different from author to author because I do have friends whose editors are not heavy editors. It's like they get something that they love and then they just are kind of like guiding the cleanup process. And that is so not my editor, and it's so not where I would thrive either. I really want to be pushed as hard as possible, and my editor does that. And I don't think my books would be even a fraction as popular as they are if not for her input, because she really pushes me to go deeper and deeper into the character especially. And I think that's like changed the way that I write, the way I think about story. And I also think that's why so many people connect with these books is because they're so character focused. So yeah, I mean, editing is hard. That's something I've learned, is it's hard. And again, it's like, as far as finding the right person, it's so tricky because when we went out on submission for Beach Read, obviously my agent had put together the list of editors, and that's usually how it works. You might have an editor that you have a personal connection to, so you ask them to be included, or you might just really love an editor and ask your agent, like, do you think that this person would like this, whatever. But by and large, it's like your agent is coming to you with a list that's already ready to go of who they know will be interested in what you're doing. And I do remember that when I read that list, I was really excited because I knew the name of one of the editors, which was Amanda Bergeron, who had edited a book called The Hating Game, which was a very, very, very charming romantic comedy by Sally Thorne. And I had loved that book so much, and it had also popped in a really big way kind of before this big romantic comedy boom in publishing. And it was just so clear that everything about it had been so thought out, like the way that it was edited in a way that, I don't know, it seemed like it made a mark. It seemed like people knew, I don't know, like it didn't seem like a book that had just been like shunted out into the world. And Amanda ended up being one of the editors who was interested in the book. And I kind of admitted to my agent, like, oh, I was so hoping it would be Amanda. And she was like, yeah, I secretly was too. And I wasn't going to say anything because I didn't want to sway you, but she is interested. And since you want that, she's like, she's the nicest like person I know in publishing, just so genuinely kind, but she's also incredibly smart. And you just like want an editor that someone's going to talk about that way. And it's true. Like I always kind of describe her as Miss Honey from Matilda, but just incredibly intelligent about the editing process and also about the business process. She's super involved in every step of the process, which again, not every editor is. And there are different methods and different approaches, and that is fine. But I feel very lucky to have an editor who's so hands-on, who, you know, wants to know every step of the marketing plan and the publicity plan, and who is really, you know, has a lot of thoughts on cover. And yeah, I mean, to me, like the more hands-on, the better. But again, that's not for everyone. Someone might want an editor who's just sort of like, I'm here to clean up your work. But she also, like you were saying, she knows my voice, she knows my goals. So it's not like she's telling me to do things that I don't want to do. If there's ever anything that doesn't click with me, I just tell her that, and that's a note that we can discard or find out, you know, figure out what the real reason for that note was and find a different solution. So it's such a collaborative process, and that is different than I expected, but it's also really wonderful.
It's fantastic. Have you, you know, when you're just going back to what you were talking about, how she's pushed you, when you look back on all of your books, you know, how have you felt your voice or your style has evolved, you know, and what you've learned, you know, in terms of how deep you go within your characters, things along those lines, you know, what, can you bring that to life in one of your stories for us?
Oh, I mean, it's so, I try not to look back that much, because when you do, you're always going to just see how you would do things differently now. And I could line edit something forever. Like if they would let me just spend a couple weeks away from a manuscript and then come back and then do that again and come back and do that again and come back, I really could just rewrite my own books into infinity and not be happy with them. So there isn't a ton of looking back happening. But I do think I think more than like noticing how I've changed or grown from book to book, I think the more that I have, the larger of a backlist that I have, the more that I see what I'm fascinated with. And yeah, I think it's more like I feel like I understand how everything is like a part of a whole. Because there's definitely like so much overlap. Like, and I wouldn't have even known, like, for example, I wouldn't have known that something I really love doing is taking an existing like trope or premise that we've seen a lot and like tilting it to its side. Like I knew I did that with book lovers. And so I did it one time and it was just sort of like, that was really fun. But then it wasn't until Funny Story that I felt like I was kind of doing the same thing again. And now I know, like, oh, that's a place that I thrive, when I can take something that I already love, like, you know, the Hallmark romance movie with the small town, like big city girl in a small town, that kind of thing. And like, now I know that something I have so much fun doing is taking an existing thing that I love and have just observed repeating across media and kind of tipping it sideways and like, I don't know, playing with it a little bit and like having sort of like my own little private joke with it almost.
You talked about not doing, or not doing sequels to any of these stories, but to your point of, you know, how you're evolving these characters, do you start thinking about where they're going or what they're doing after these stories end, or are you ready to move on to the next thing?
I'm usually ready to move on to the next thing. When I'm in events and people ask me, like, you know, what do you think these people are doing right now? Or how do you think these characters from two different books would get along or whatever? sometimes I'm just in the right mood that when they ask those questions, I instantly have an answer, and it feels like, oh yeah, I can, those people are definitely still out there living their lives and I can imagine it. But I don't have like a sustained story for any of them. And that's why at this point, there's not probably going to be, I mean, there might be sequels at some point, but at this point, there's just not anything that's like calling to me. So yeah, when I finish a book, I usually do feel like, okay, I'm done. I've closed that chapter. But I also do notice that there's usually some, there's sort of like a hangover in the book, in every book, where it's like there are pieces of things that it's clear I hadn't totally finished working out from the last book. And you can kind of see that I was still toying with those things. I think a really good example is before I wrote Beach Read, I had written this young adult novel called A Million Junes, and I finished it, and then I wrote Beach Read. And there is so, even though it's like they're different genres and different age groups, there is so much overlap in what I was thinking about and dealing with. And it's like both, you know, there's just so much, there's so much in common between those two narrating characters, where they both have like these loving, larger than life fathers that died in kind of tragic circumstances, and that both of their fathers had all of these secrets, and both of their journeys are sort of about reconciling like the person that you idolized and loved more than anyone in the world with like who they actually were, their complications and their failures and all of that. So when I finish a book, I think I'm done, but then sometimes I find things creeping back in, and I even have projects that, you know, I have not published, but ideas that I started working on and really liked. And then when it's been time to move on to the next book, I've had to, you know, talk to my editor and be like, oh, do you think that this idea that I was working on could be the next book? And then I'll realize, oh no, they're too similar. Like I have to set that aside and do something different. And maybe I'll go back to it and change the character, or maybe there'll just have been enough books in between that it won't feel like I'm retreading the same ground. But that's definitely something I notice. It's like a book length of time is not always enough time for me to work out everything I'm thinking about.
Tell us about the first big success. What did that feel like with your team that you obviously are so comfortable with? And, you know, when you are a New York Times bestseller and your books are, you know, people are, because your fans are pretty, they love you and they love these stories. I mean, my little bookstore here had a sleepover event for a funny story coming out. I mean, people amazing. They love them. So tell us about that first time where you're like, I made it.
Well, I don't know. It's weird because, you know, I had been publishing young adult novels before this, and they were very mid-list, meaning like I had readers, but not a ton of them. And my books stayed on the shelves for exactly 3 months after release, and then they were culled and replaced by other new releases. And so I knew what the more traditional author experience was, which I'm super grateful for, because I think I would probably be an insufferable monster if I had just like started out being successful. Just like, this is how it works. It's easy. I don't know what everyone's complaining about. But so I had that experience. And actually my last young adult novel was called When the Sky Fell on Splendor. And it was like, from start to finish, just sort of a devastating experience working on that book. Like it felt like my career was shrinking and shrinking, and it felt like nobody understood this thing that I was making, and it felt closer to my heart than anything I'd written before. And it was just like, just the whole process from selling it, editing it, its release was just sort of brutal. And then I sold Beach Read, and it was so weird because I sold Beach Read in a preempt, which means we took it out on submission. There were a couple of editors who were starting to be interested. And then I had that conversation with my agent where I said, I was really hoping it would be Amanda. I'm so glad she's come to the table. And she said, okay, well, we can offer her a preempt to take it off the table, and we won't go to auction or anything like that. We'll just go with her. And so it was like a much better deal than I had gotten for any of my YA books, but still not like the kind of thing that people are writing articles about, being like, this, you know, this is going to be big. It was just sort of like a nice, healthy deal, I would say, where you're like, wow, that's great. And it was a 2-book deal, which was also exciting because I'd never had one of those. And so it had been sort of like clearly already shaping up differently than my YA had been. But then as we were doing like the editing, and I went to New York to meet the rest of the team, I really just had this sense in my gut that this was like going to catch in a really big way, like before it did. It was a really strange thing because I felt like I was mourning this last book that had meant so much to me, and coming to terms with the fact that nobody can really tell you the value of your own art, because I really felt like that book was so important to me and it needed to be written. And there's like a handful of people that it means a lot to, and then everyone else hates it. And so I was really coming to terms with that and accepting like the business success does not have much to do with how you feel as far as your success as an artist, if you did what you were trying to do. And then I sold Beach Read, and I was like, oh, I can just tell this is like shaping up differently. This is going to be successful on some level. I didn't know how successful, but I thought like this is, gonna be something. And I just felt it. Everything felt so different. And I was also, not saying most of this aloud because I was afraid of jinxing it. And then I remember the day, like, a week after the book came out, the day that the New York Times list would post, that morning, it occurred to me, like, this might actually hit the list. But I also didn't know, because it's like, you don't know how, it's all so obfuscated. Like, you don't know how the list works, and you don't really know your sales numbers, and you don't know how well a book is supposed to sell. It all is just kind of cloaked in mystery. And I remember emailing my editor that morning that the list would post and just being like, hey, totally fine if this is not going to happen, but I just was wondering, is it like even a possibility that this might hit the list? And then basically I found out that she was like, we're not talking about this because we're all very superstitious. And I was like, I'm very sorry. But then the list came out around 5, and she and my agent called me and told me, and it was, I forget, like, it wasn't like a number one, that first one wasn't, but it was on the list. And I was very, very shocked. And also, like, it came out like right into the start of the pandemic, and so nobody really knew if people were going to be reading or if we were all just lying on our floors, like staring at our ceilings, reckoning with mortality. And yeah, it was, I mean, more than anything, I feel like it was just a bizarre experience, because it was like, you're so isolated at that point, and
Right.
then you're getting this like incredible news, but also like the rest of the news of the world is pretty bad. I mean, it felt out of body, and it was the kind of thing where I had to keep going back to check once she'd sent the list through to make sure I hadn't like misunderstood what was going on.
With the success, and then Beach Read and Book Lovers and all the the continued success, and what we were talking about first with them becoming movies and becoming series. What I think Funny Story is the first one that you're going to stay on and screenwrite as well,
Yeah.
right? How talk to us about like how you make that decision, and what does it feel like to kind of let those other ones go into someone else's hands, and then making the decision to be a part and hold on with Funny Story.
Yeah, I mean, really, so much of my decision-making process for those first few was out of fear. I can now say it was really, I did not feel confident that I could pull off a screenplay. I think I'd written one screenplay for fun at that point, maybe I hadn't even written it yet, but I wasn't sure I could do it. And I also knew from friends who had gone before me that adaptations are super, super, super tricky. And a lot of times the studios, the production companies, the director, a lot of times they don't want the novelist attached, because they expect us to be, I mean, for a lot of reasons, but I think primarily because they expect us to be too precious and to not be able to see what the screenplay needs, because we're so attached to the book and all of that. And because I wanted to give these movies their best shot at actually getting made, I knew, like, if I say, oh, I'm writing this, there's going to instantly be a lot of people who are like, well, then we're out. We're not here for the conversation. It's not going to happen. Because I'd seen that happen with a lot of friends. And so I wanted these movies to happen, and I wanted them to be good. And I wasn't sure that my being involved would enable either of those two outcomes. I thought, could make it not happen and also could make it happen, but it's bad. So I just sort of took myself out of the running. And then I had a few years of different deals being made, and kind of watching over the shoulder of different writers, taking cracks at the script and producer notes and studio notes and all of that. And it became a very frustrating experience because I know these books so intimately because of my editor, because she has already asked every single question that can be asked about these characters and forced me to answer them. And I understand their motivations. And I also very intentionally build my books. I mean, whether you buy into them or not, if you don't like my books, then you will disagree with this. But I do very intentionally build my books around two characters, each of which has a flaw, an issue that they need to work through to be together. And their two issues are in direct conflict. And that is how the whole story happens, is because these two people need to each face something in order to be together. And being together, being close to one another is exacerbating these things that they need to fix. And so I have it all locked up in my brain. It feels like this weird little puzzle. And again, my editor's never letting me off the hook. I have to understand why my characters are doing everything they're doing, or what they're doing has to change. And so watching other people who are great writers, but who didn't spend a year plus deep in these characters' heads, try to figure out why something isn't working on the script level, felt really frustrating, because it would be like, oh, I could just tell you. I could just tell you, but you don't want to hear, so I can't just tell you. And kind of seeing the same issues arise again and again in different drafts of the script, and feeling like if I were really invited to be a part of this room, then I think that we could have made this happen much sooner. And now I've got the imposter syndrome of maybe I'm kidding myself, but that was the experience for years. It was watching over other people's shoulders and thinking, I actually think that I do know how to fix this if someone would just let me. And when we decided to, so we went out with Happy Place last year, I think before the writer's strike, and we got some interest, and some people wanted to do film, some people wanted to do TV. Largely they wanted to do TV, and we picked a great team with that. And I had been saying, when I thought it was going to be a film, I'd been saying, I want to write Happy Place, I want to write the movie. And then we ended up selling it as a show, and I was like, I do not want to write a show. I do not want to write a show. I would be open to helping develop the show, and I'd be open to writing an episode of the show, but I don't want to shepherd that whole thing. I'm not there yet. And so, sold that as a show, and then moved on to trying to sell a funny story. And then that time I was like, okay, we're doing this as a movie and I want to write it. And again, it was I knew that meant even at this point, there would be people who just kind of took themselves off the table. And there was one group that I met with who, was a very sought after, beloved production company that I had, kind of high hopes for. And I met with them, and they were like, no, we don't let authors adapt their own stuff. And also kind of implied that you'll be back in a year. When you go to write this for someone else, you're going to hate it, and you'll come back to us and we'll make it with a writer that we've chosen. But I only had one group that I met with who did that, and everyone else was like, yeah, of course we want you to write it. That's fine. So that was the journey. It was kind of just a journey of building up my own confidence in my abilities, and also just getting really frustrated and being like, here, let me do it. Let me try. Let me at least try. And if it doesn't work, then we'll find someone else. But I finally, found the project that it made sense for me to try, and a team who's excited to let me try.
I think it's interesting that you're more interested in a movie than a series. I think it would be hard to condense your book down to 2 hours versus, something that could be 4, 6, 8 episodes. That I would have guessed the opposite.
Well, the thing is, what's interesting is, at least in my experience, and I know Hollywood changes on a dime, but in my experience, it feels like nobody right now wants to do limited series.
Yeah.
they want, because they're just too expensive to set up and then abandon after one season. And so part of it's that if people wanted to do limited series of my books, I'd feel a lot more interested. But in general, that's not what people want. They want to make ongoing series where they take your book as the jumping off point, and then there's future seasons, because it's just easier to pitch, easier to sell, easier to make, because you're not just burning money for one season. So if it's between ongoing series and film, then film is going to be my choice usually for most projects. And then aside from that, like, I fell in love with romantic comedies through movies. It wasn't through books. And now I love the books, to be clear. I'm a huge fan of this genre. But it wasn't my introduction, and it wasn't, I don't think, where I got my sensibilities. Like, I think that came much more from movies. And so even though it will be a challenge and not everything from the book could possibly make it into a movie, I'm really excited to try to make a story of mine feel like those movies felt to me.
That you loved so much. Yeah, that is interesting. That is.
Emily, who do you read at this point? Who are your go-to authors, or who are the ones that you get inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, I read very, very widely, and I think that's like a common thing for writers, is like you're not just reading in your own genre. I will say in kind of the romantic comedies / women's fiction space, I really love Vari McFarlane. She is so funny, but also gut punchy, and writes these really excellent, like, real life villains. They're not like, super villains. They're just like the people that you encounter in life who make you mad. So I really love her, and she's someone who every time there's a new book out, I go running. On the more dramatic side of that same genre, I would say Kennedy Ryan. She writes really beautiful, kind of angsty love stories. I love Taylor Jenkins Reid's, like, his, vaguely historical book club fiction is so fun. I genuinely read everything. Like, Gillian McAllister writes really wonderful thrillers, and Gillian Flynn, obviously. I read everything. I read everything.
I love that, your point of reading. One of our authors that we talked to, like Renee said, we've been talking to a lot of authors, and she talked about Stephen King's writing book.
Yeah.
And which I'm not a writer, but I bought it because I was like, that sounds interesting. And my favorite thing, first of all, I devoured it. It's so easy to read, but it was read. You can't be a writer without reading. Read, yes. Like, he basically had a chapter that's had one word: read. And Renee and I are both huge readers, obviously devouring your books. But I thought that was just like such an interesting point of how can you be a great writer without reading just so much?
I don't think you can. And I'm also really suspicious of writers who aren't ever talking about what they're reading, which is maybe not fair. Maybe they just don't like talking about it. But if I notice a writer, if there's like a writer who's like a very public person, but you never know what they're reading, I'm sort of like, what's going on? I mean, I'm sure they're reading, but yes, I think that is kind of the most important piece of things is, I feel like you learn or for me, I guess, I mostly learn through experience. And so reading and writing are like the two biggest pieces of advice I would give to any writer. It's not necessarily like, go buy this book or like download this form for planning, your plot and structure and all of that. It's like, just read a ton and write a ton, and eventually you'll figure it out. You'll get it into your body.
Well, Emily, it has been so nice to meet you. It's gone so fast, but we are huge fans. So we were fangirling to get to meet you, and so lucky that it was at such an exciting time with all these announcements. We couldn't be more thrilled to get to meet you and to get to see all of these books that we love come to the big screen and the small screen.
Well, thank you so much. This was really a wonderful chat, and I appreciate both of you for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you so much, Emily. It was lovely to meet you.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To stay up to date with In Her Words, join the conversation by following Women in Entertainment on our social channels and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at womeninentertainment.com.